You hear it all the time. True socialism has never been tried. It doesn't matter how many times we point to the death toll under Stalin and Mao, under Castro, under Chavez, under Pol Pot. Apologists will always say, that's not true socialism, just give us one more chance. This time, we'll get it right.
The Soviet Union, for example, was called a socialist society. But this was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine.
Oh my God, we're becoming a socialist country. So what? If it works, that's all that matters. Let's just do what works.
Democratic socialism is having a government which reflects the interest of ordinary people rather than is currently the case of the billionaire class.
But the very principle of a health service as a right and free at the point of use is surely something that we can all be proud of. And that, my friends, owes its origins to those socialist thinkers in the 19th century that saw the evils of free market capitalism.
Well, as it turns out, true socialism has been tried. 100 years ago, a man named Vladimir Lenin led a revolution to implement the purest form of Marxism ever attempted. How did it turn out? About as well as you'd expect. Petrograd, 1917. Russia is about to undergo one of the most climactic revolutions in history. Beaten down by war, poverty, and starvation, the Russian people were hungry for something, anything to give them hope. A rising communist movement saw this as an opportunity to seize power with their grandiose claims of freedom and equality. They called themselves the Bolsheviks. And their October Revolution would shape the rest of 20th century history. Under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, a radical Marxist with ambition and charisma to spare, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace. The provisional government and cabinet surrendered and were arrested. Across the city, resistance to the coup was stunningly light. The violence really began once the Bolsheviks had control and began to implement their puritanical vision of a socialist revolution. Lenin was unapologetic about his methods, writing that not a single problem of the class struggle has ever been solved in history except by violence. When violence is exercised by the working people, by the mass of exploited against the exploiters, then we are all for it. But Lenin was more than just another thug. He was an ideologue who truly believed in the principles of socialism as articulated by Karl Marx. If he was willing to break a few eggs, it was for the greater good of making Marx's vision a reality. Marx himself was a German intellectual who dreamed of a world without money, without private property, without class systems, where each would give according to their ability and receive according to their need. He wanted to destroy the system he dubbed capitalism, where the owners of land and machines could employ laborers for profit, and replace it with one based on cooperation and equality. Marx believed in a predetermined arc of history. First comes capitalism, and then socialism, and then communism. And while communism was supposed to be a utopian paradise, socialism, by definition, was a dictatorship of the proletariat, a dictatorship that was explicitly violent. According to Marx and his minions, the only way to realize the dream of communism is through bloodshed. Marx himself encouraged sustained violence as part of his revolution, saying, far from opposing the so-called excesses, instances of popular vengeance against hated individuals or against public buildings with which hated memories are associated, the Workers' Party must not only tolerate these actions, but must even give them direction. Frederick Engels, who co-wrote the Communist Manifesto with Marx, went even further, noting that in the revolution, if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror with which its arms inspire. Ever wonder why it is that communist protesters show up at rallies with clubs and masks? It's because violence is baked into the philosophy, going all the way back to Marx and Engels. The new vision of communism was igniting workers' movements all across the world. But it wasn't until Lenin discovered Karl Marx's magnum opus, the insufferable doorstop Das Kapital, that the seeds of communism in Russia were sown in earnest. Marx's mistake was the same one made by all advocates of socialism. He thought that political and intellectual leaders could be smart enough to plan a society from the top down, not only allocating the resources of an entire economy through a central plan, but by deliberately designing the arc of history itself. It was a vision of unbelievable arrogance. Whereas Marx was a dreamer, Lenin was a man of action. He was determined to put the ideas of communism into practice as quickly as possible. And he had no qualms about using violence to do it. All he needed was an opportunity. That opportunity came under the rule of Tsar Nicholas Romanov. 50 years earlier, Alexander II had freed Russian serfs from bondage, but the strict class system meant that this had little effect in practice, and the ruling class remained quick to put down any whispers of unrest with brutal violence. Nicholas compounded the problem with poor military judgment, and by the time Russia entered World War I, conscription, food shortages, and bread lines left the Russian people hungry and angrier than ever.